They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
Listen closely, because what I am about to tell you sounds like a Hollywood script, but it is the cold, terrifying reality of the American underworld during its most untouchable era. If you want to understand the sheer magnitude of the Mafia's power in the 1960s, you only have to look at a secret FBI wiretap from May 1962. Meyer Lansky, the mob's financial mastermind, was holed up in a bugged suite at the Volney Hotel in Manhattan, recovering from a heart attack. While watching a television panel discuss organized crime, Lansky turned to his wife and casually dropped a bombshell that should chill every law-abiding citizen to the bone: "We're bigger than U.S. Steel." He wasn't exaggerating. At the time, the Justice Department conservatively estimated that the Mafia's illicit profits rivaled the combined earnings of the 10 largest industrial corporations in America, including heavyweights like General Motors, Ford, IBM, and yes, U.S. Steel. The syndicate was hauling in a staggering $7 billion to $10 billion a year from gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics. Yet, just as the government began to grasp the size of this invisible empire, the FBI inexplicably blinked. By 1964, J. Edgar Hoover officially downgraded the Mafia as a vital priority, pulled the critical electronic bugs from mob hangouts, and redirected his agents to chase subversives and anti-war radicals like the Weathermen, and even civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. The New York Police Department mirrored this disastrous shift, transferring their top Mafia experts into the Bureau of Special Services Investigations, the Red Squad, to focus on political dissidents and riots. With the heat turned off, the mob was given a free ride. Out on the streets, the new generation of gangsters proudly dubbed themselves wiseguys, operating with absolute impunity. "Everyone I knew was into money schemes and almost nobody ever got caught," remembered Lucchese associate Henry Hill, noting that the lack of law enforcement led them to believe the lifestyle was no longer dangerous. They lived like royalty. In the summer of 1964, police bugs caught Lucchese Capos casually inviting Frank Sinatra and his entourage up to their East Harlem social club for an impromptu feast of steaks and sausage. But while most of the authorities looked the other way, a few relentless crusaders kept hunting. One of them was NYPD Detective Ralph Salerno, a man driven by a deeply personal vendetta against his own kind. Before Salerno was even born, his immigrant parents were traumatized when his mother witnessed a local hood named Mickey Icebox gun down a rival right in front of her. Later, armed mobsters fleeing the police burst into his family's apartment through a fire escape and held them hostage. A week later, they sent Salerno's father a straight-edged razor and an engraved shaving mug as a terrifying thank you for his silence. Salerno kept that mug on his desk for decades as a reminder of the predators he was fighting, ultimately leaving the force in 1967 because he realized the Mafia had grown 20 times more powerful than it was in his parents' era. And with that unchecked power came massive, explosive greed. Beneath the serene surface of the New York syndicates, a volcano was erupting. Joe Bonanno, one of the original 5 founding Godfathers, made a treacherous play to become the supreme boss of bosses. The Mafia Commission caught wind of his power grab, sparking the Bloody Bananas War. On a rainy October night in 1964, Bonanno was allegedly kidnapped at gunpoint on Park Avenue by his own cousin's men. He vanished for 19 months, hiding out in New York and Tucson, though sharp-eared detectives like Salerno doubted it was a real kidnapping. Wiretaps revealed that Bonanno's own men weren't mourning him with the traditional respect reserved for a dead boss, but were instead complaining, "That son of a bitch took off and left us here alone." The commission ultimately crushed Bonanno's rebellion, forcing the once mighty Godfather into permanent exile in Arizona. The arrogance of the surviving Godfathers was staggering, eventually leading to a humiliating, almost comedic blunder. On a Thursday afternoon in September 1966, 13 of the most powerful Mafia leaders in America, including Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo, Carlos Marcello, and Santo Trafficante, gathered for a lavish lunch at La Stella, a modest restaurant in Queens. Before they could even taste their cocktails, plainclothes police stormed the private dining room and arrested the entire baker's dozen. Hauled into the station house, The impeccably dressed kings of the underworld were stripped to their underwear, fingerprinted, and photographed like common street thugs. The local district attorney, Nat Handel, hyped the arrests as a historic bust dubbed Little Appalachian, milking it for political publicity. But the mobsters had the last laugh. Since the authorities had no actual evidence of a crime, the men were released, and Handel lost his election. To rub salt in the government's wounds, Southern bosses Marcello and Trafficante returned to La Stella a week later with their lawyers. Smiling for the press cameras, they mockingly asked, "Why don't they arrest us now?" Before sitting down to the exact feast they had been denied, escarole in brodo, linguine with white clam sauce, and baked clams. When legendary Lucchese boss Tommy Three Finger Brown died of a brain tumor months later, his funeral perfectly illustrated the syndicate's untouchable status. Hundreds of mafiosi gathered, rubbing shoulders with eminent judges, politicians, and legitimate businessmen who were all indebted to the criminal mastermind. For the young men watching from the street corners of working-class neighborhoods, the message was intoxicating. As one police chief noted, the boys in Brooklyn saw the bookies, the enforcers, and the wealth, and they listened to the blood-soaked tales of glory. It is no wonder they treated the mob like an elite fraternity, hoping that with enough guts and luck, they too could graduate to join that splendid, high-living band of criminals. Picture a bright young lawyer named George Robert Blakey, stepping out of the quiet, segregation-era town of Burlington, North Carolina, a place where the word mafia was virtually non-existent, and walking straight into the blood-soaked, shadowy epicenter of the American underworld. It is the early 1960s, and Blakey, a top-of-his-class Notre Dame graduate, has just landed a job in the Justice Department's Organized Crime and Racketeering section. Under the relentless crusade of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, the FBI begins feeding Blakey's unit raw intelligence from illegal bugs. For the first time, this young attorney is exposed to the chilling reality of blood oaths, secret induction ceremonies, and the unbreakable code of omerta. When Kennedy resigns in 1964, a disillusioned Blakey returns to Notre Dame to teach, initiating a popular course his students irreverently dubbed the Gangbusters class. But the criminal underworld pulls him back. Serving on President Lyndon B. Johnson's Crime Commission in the late 1960s, Blakey read a groundbreaking analysis comparing the mob to a complex industrial corporation. The mafia, he realizes, is a mirror image of American capitalism, complete with diversified systems of plunder. That is his eureka moment. For decades, law enforcement had been hunting individual gangsters for single crimes. Blakey realizes that to truly cripple the mob, you have to target the entire corporate structure, the mafia family itself. To forge this ultimate legal weapon, Blakey teams up with Senator John McClellan, a hard-nosed, Old Testament-style politician from Arkansas who had spent over a decade staring down arrogant, defiant mobsters in union corruption hearings. Together, they draft the Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. The crown jewel of this legislation is a section specifically designed to rip out the heart of the mafia. As a massive fan of gangster films, Blakey purposefully names the statute RICO, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, a nod to the ruthless mobster RICO in the classic 1931 movie Little Caesar. RICO is a legal masterpiece, built on two lethal, foundational concepts, pattern and enterprise. Under RICO, prosecutors no longer have to catch a boss pulling a trigger. If they can prove a mobster committed just 2 out of 20 specified felonies, including murder, extortion, loan sharking, and gambling, over a 10-year period on behalf of a corrupt enterprise, like a mafia family, that mobster can be locked away for 20 years. But Blakey and McClellan do not stop there, they want to bleed the mob dry. They write in civil and antitrust provisions allowing the government to seize a gangster's illicit assets, homes, and bank accounts, and even oust mob leaders from corrupt unions. Getting a law with such sweeping, draconian power through Congress is an absolute dogfight. Representative Emanuel Seller, the liberal chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, attempts to gut the RICO section by forcing the bill into a compromise committee conference. But McClellan brilliantly outmaneuvers him, accepting the House's amended version of the bill on non-RICO issues, totally bypassing Seller's trap. On October 15, 1970, President Richard M. Nixon signed the act into law, handing the pen to his Attorney General, John Mitchell, with the command, "Go get the crooks." In a delicious twist of historical irony, a minor immunity provision hidden within that very same act eventually compels testimony that destroys both Nixon's presidency and Mitchell's career during the Watergate scandal. With the ultimate mob-busting weapon now on the books, you would expect federal prosecutors to be popping champagne. You would be dead wrong. For years, the Justice Department and the FBI have completely ignored RICO, terrified of risking their easy conviction rates on an untested, highly complex statute. Blakey, acting like an itinerant evangelist, travels the country begging law enforcement to use his creation. They view him as a fuzzy-minded academic. In 1972, when Blakey pitches the law to the prestigious U.S. Attorney's office in Manhattan, the region's top federal prosecutor, Whitney North Seymour Jr., literally orders Blakey out of his conference room, telling him he doesn't know what he's talking about. Instead of systemic dismantlement of the mafia, the FBI relies on scalp collectors' agents hunting for simple, individual arrests that create the illusion of progress without ever threatening the real apex predators. Even the newly granted power of court-authorized wiretaps is squandered on quickie gambling busts. By 1976, one frustrated U.S. attorney, David G. Traeger, publicly blasts the FBI as suffering from arteriosclerosis and wasting resources on absolute trivia. For an entire decade, the godfathers of the American Mafia continued to feast on the nation's economy, completely unaware that a law professor from North Carolina had already built the machine that would eventually bring their empires crashing down to the ground. Monday, June 28, 1971, was a beautiful, clear day, absolutely tailor-made for Joseph Anthony Colombo and his massive Italian-American Unity Day rally right in the heart of New York City. Tens of thousands of people were pouring into Columbus Circle, gathering under the towering statue of Christopher Columbus. Plastic red, white, and green buntings fluttered in the breeze as a smiling Colombo ambled past his adoring fans, soaking in the applause he craved. He was cresting on a wave of unprecedented public popularity, having pulled off the ultimate underworld paradox. He was simultaneously the godfather of one of New York's 5 mafia families and the founder of the Italian-American Civil Rights League. But the festivities were about to be shattered in a spray of blood. Amidst the roar of the crowd and blaring band music, 3 muffled pops from an ancient .32 caliber pistol rang out. Bullets tore into Colombo's head and neck, dropping the powerful boss paralyzed to the pavement as blood gushed from his mouth and ears. To understand how a feared mafia boss ended up bleeding out at a public rally, you have to look at the man's violent roots. Colombo grew up in South Brooklyn, where mob justice was a terrifying reality. When he was just 16, his own father, a made man named Tony, was brutally garroted alongside a girlfriend in the back of a car. But that didn't deter young Joe. He ascended the ranks, taking control of his crime family at the unusually young age of 41. This rapid promotion didn't sit well with the old guard. Wiretaps caught rival bosses like Sam the Plumber de Cavalcante grumbling that Colombo was nothing but a bust-out man, a petty operator of dice games who had ridden Carlo Gambino's coattails to power. Unlike the traditional secretive dons, Colombo learned to play the part of a prosperous, middle-class citizen. He moved his wife and 5 children into a split-level home in Bensonhurst, bought a 5-acre country estate near the Hudson River, and masqueraded as a real estate salesman to appease the IRS. He also possessed a brazen defiance toward law enforcement. When a high-ranking detective named Albert Seidman called him in for questioning about a murder, Colombo showed up alone and launched into a blistering tirade, screaming, "I'm an American citizen, first class," and accusing the police of harassing him just because his name was Italian. That potent mix of ethnic pride and absolute audacity gave birth to his civil rights crusade. The catalyst was his son Joe Jr.'s trial for a silver conspiracy in 1970. Fed up with the FBI's relentless heat, Colombo organized the Italian-American Civil Rights League, turning his personal grievances into a national movement. And it worked brilliantly. The league exploded to 45,000 dues-paying members, drawing the support of powerful politicians like Governor Nelson Rockefeller and forcing Attorney General John Mitchell to outright ban federal agencies from using the terms mafia and Cosa Nostra. Colombo was a master manipulator of the press, appearing on late-night TV and pleading ignorance to the murders, torture chambers, and loan-sharking rings attributed to him. His influence even seeped into Hollywood, where the producers of the iconic film The Godfather eagerly agreed to strike the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra from their script and hired Colombo's own golfers as extras. Benefit dinners netted hundreds of thousands of dollars, and Frank Sinatra himself headlined a massive fundraiser at Madison Square Garden that raised $500,000. But in the shadowy underworld, you cannot court the glaring spotlight without blinding your allies. Colombo's relentless picketing of the FBI and his high-profile television appearances deeply angered his mafia brethren, especially the omnipotent Carlo Gambino. Other mafiosi grew suspicious that Colombo was pocketing the league's massive funds, creating dangerous jealousy and resentment over being cut out of what they viewed as a lucrative new racket. The old-school bosses preferred to operate in the shadows, and Colombo was practically inviting the authorities to scrutinize their every move with his endless grandstanding. Which brings us back to that bloody pavement at Columbus Circle. The man who pulled the trigger was Jerome Johnson, a young black man masquerading as a press photographer with a bogus camera. Johnson never made it out of the crowd alive. He was instantly shot and killed by Colombo's bodyguards in the ensuing pandemonium. The mysterious female accomplice who allegedly provided his press credentials vanished into thin air, leaving detectives with a chillingly brilliant kamikaze hit. Chief of Detectives Albert Seidman analyzed the brazen daylight assassination and concluded that Johnson, a man whose head was in outer space, had been expertly manipulated as a fall guy with false promises of money and an escape route. The true architect of the assassination, Seidman believed, was none other than the ruthless Crazy Joey Gallo, executing a lethal message from the underworld that public grandstanding carries a fatal price. Step right into the gritty underworld of 1970s Brooklyn, where Joseph Crazy Joey Gallo earned his terrifying nickname as a volatile enforcer and hitman for Joe Profasi's gambling and loan sharking rackets. Operating out of a headquarters on President Street in the Red Hook section, Gallo was known as a ruthless, unschooled predator. However, an 8-year stretch in state prison fundamentally altered Gallo's public persona. He emerged reading Balzac, Kafka, Sartre, and Camus, visiting museums, and painting, a pseudo-intellectual transformation that served as a brilliant con man's camouflage. At this same time, the underworld was completely hypnotized by Mario Puzo's The Godfather. The romanticized tale of the fictional Corleone family struck a deep chord with actual mobsters, validating their lifestyle and making them feel like members of a respected, benevolent society rather than merciless killers. Young up-and-comers like Salvatore Semi the Bull Gravano walked out of the theater absolutely stunned and floating on air, viewing the movie's music, dancing, and twisted honor as a heroic reflection of their own lives. But Hollywood magic doesn't stop real bullets, and Crazy Joey Gallo's defiance finally caught up with him at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy. The chilling details of his demise come straight from Joseph Luparelli, a bottom-level Colombo flunky and gopher who was desperate to earn his stripes and become a made man. Shortly before 5 a.m., Luparelli was grabbing a bowl of red clam chowder when he spotted Gallo's jubilant party arriving at the restaurant. Luparelli tipped off the assassins, who carried out the hit and then fled uptown to an East Side apartment to receive congratulations from their capo. Although murdering a man in front of his family violated strict mafia protocol, the underworld justified Gallo's slaughter as necessary retaliation for his unsanctioned hit on boss Joe Colombo. While the Colombo family was settling its violent scores, another ruthless predator was making a brazen power grab, Carmine Galante. Out on parole and masquerading as a dry cleaning store owner on Elizabeth Street, Galante made a treacherous play to control the Bonanno family and monopolize the deadly narcotics market. To enforce his will, he imported vicious Sicilian immigrants known as Zips, heavily relying on two young killers from Castellammare del Golfo, Baldassare Amato, and Cesar Bonventure, to act as his personal guards. Galante's arrogance and blatant attempt to dominate the drug trade alarmed the other New York godfathers, who quickly declared him persona non grata. Galante's reign came to a spectacularly gruesome end on the steamy afternoon of July 12, 1979. Galante was attending a Bon Voyage luncheon in the patio of the Joe and Mary Italian-American restaurant in Bushwick, Brooklyn. Joining him at the table were his trusted Zips, Amato, and Bonventure, alongside a drug dealer named Leonardo Coppola. At 2:45 p.m., three ski-masked men stormed the restaurant, sending the owner's teenage son scrambling for his life before he was shot in the buttocks. The assassins unleashed a devastating barrage of shotgun and automatic handgun fire into the patio, killing Galante and Coppola instantly. Galante was blasted backward by a shotgun wound to his left eye, dying with his trademark cigar still clenched tightly between his teeth. Picture a beautiful, placid Saturday afternoon in August 1979. Miles away from the grit and gunfire of the New York underworld. FBI agents James Kostler and Jules Benevolente found themselves staring at the idyllic, sailboat-dotted waters of Cayuga Lake at Cornell University, wondering what on earth they were doing there. These were hardened investigators, yet they had been exiled to this upstate New York campus by their new boss, Neil Welch, an iconoclastic reformer who had recently taken over the FBI's New York office. Welch was a legendary maverick, a man who once literally took a pair of scissors and snipped the telephone lines of a timid supervisor who dared to ask Washington for permission to act. He wanted his agents to play a whole new ballgame, gather intelligence, but ultimately, lock the top people up. Welch had dispatched Kostler, a former teacher of mentally retarded children turned labor racket specialist, and Benevolente, an organized crime expert, to Cornell for a very specific reason. They were there to listen to G. Robert Blakey, the law professor who had authored the RICO Act, at his newly established Institute on Organized Crime. At first, the agents felt like fish out of water among the state prosecutors. But then, Blakey transformed from a mild-mannered academic into a fire and brimstone preacher. Blakey hit them with a Hollywood metaphor that would change the course of criminal history. He brought up the classic 1931 gangster film Little Caesar, pointing out that while the street-level thug Rico gets gunned down in an alley, the tuxedo-clad boss, the big boy, escapes completely untouched because nobody investigated him. Blakey's message was chillingly clear: law enforcement had been acting like wolves picking off the sick and weak deer, leaving the organized crime herd stronger than ever. RICO was designed specifically to change the end of that movie. The strategy was a 1-2 punch. Blakey taught the agents that RICO had to be paired with Title III court-authorized bugs and wiretaps. Investigators needed to stop chasing individual crimes and instead prove the existence of an enterprise. They could use the evidence from one bug to justify the next, climbing the underworld ladder rung by rung until there was nowhere left for the Godfathers to hide. Fired up with a new, lethal roadmap, Costler and Benevolente returned to the concrete jungle of New York to clean house. What they found was a bureaucratic nightmare. The FBI's New York operations were so fragmented that different squads were constantly tripping over each other. In one embarrassing debacle, 4 different squads were running 6 overlapping investigations into Genevieve's capo Matty the Horsey Aniello, effectively tipping him off that he was a target. In another almost comedic blunder, agents baffled by a mysterious hoodlum working with a Genevieve's associate eventually discovered the hood was actually an undercover informant working for a different FBI unit. Costler recognized that the Mafia was simply better organized than the FBI, and that had to change. He drafted a sweeping 25-point master plan that completely dismantled the old system, replacing it with 5 dedicated squads, one to exclusively hunt down each of the 5 New York crime families. The strategy shifted away from low-level arrests and focused the FBI's crosshairs directly on the bosses and their multi-million-dollar labor rackets. To their absolute astonishment, FBI Director William Webster approved the radical plan in less than a month, signaling that the Bureau was finally ready to declare all-out war on the Mafia. Webster handed them the ultimate weapon: permission to use super-secret spy cameras and listening devices, equipment previously restricted entirely to counter-espionage operations against foreign agents. This elite gear was handed over to a special operations group led by James Kallstrom, an imaginative ex-Marine tasked with penetrating the Mafia's most secure fortresses. To protect this fragile new crusade from the FBI's own stifling bureaucracy, Benevolente was transferred to headquarters in Washington. He served as a crucial shield, running interference against the dreaded bean counters, the headquarters inspectors who only cared about easy arrest quotas and budget spreadsheets, keeping them off the backs of the New York agents who were building massive, time-consuming cases. The pieces were finally in place. During a dinner at the Downtown Athletic Club in Manhattan, Bob Blakey laid out his ultimate dream to Costler. He didn't just want to take down one boss, he wanted to indict every single Godfather in New York in one massive courtroom showdown. It sounded like an impossible fantasy, but the FBI had finally wised up, built the machine, and was quietly setting the stage for an attack aimed directly at the heart of the American Mafia.